Thank you very much, Anne, for that very kind and very full introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. As a non-Joycean, as Anne mentioned, I'll have to keep reiterating that to make sure my cultural insecurity doesn't explode. I was lucky enough to be introduced to Joyce by Gus Martin when he was teaching here at the very end of the 1980s, and it certainly struck me that the historian in me, the budding historian in me, would have to keep particularly attuned to what Joyce might have to say to the historian about how they might characterise some of the earlier decades of the 20th century. And I suppose I have been thinking about that in various forms over the last 10 or 15 years. It's very important, I think, for the historians of modern Ireland to look at our great writers, to look at some of the literature and how it might be used in terms of how we characterise the evolution of Irish nationalism, the evolution of Irish society, the evolution of Irish politics over the course of the 20th century. And it's one of the reasons why I was delighted to accept Anne's invitation, was to try and give you some sense of historical perspective about this crucial period, 1922 to 1939. I do remember some of those earlier lectures in the late 1980s about a portrait of the artist in particular, the sense in which Stephen is grappling with all sorts of legacies of events of the late 19th century into the early 20th century in particular. How they are played out in subsequent decades is really what I want to talk about today. And it also, of course, coincides with a crucial period for Joyce. So that, I think, is why I am here. It's why I'm very grateful to be here. I'm delighted to see such an interesting and diverse audience. I do hope that some of the historical issues that were of such paramount importance during this period, that we will begin to look at them in a variety of different ways, through a variety of different prisms. There are all sorts of different perspectives that have emerged on the Free State as it became in 1922 during its crucial formative decades, the 1920s and the 1930s. And I really just want to give you a flavour of where we are at now with regards to how we might interpret the 1920s and the 1930s. What were the particular challenges that were there? What were the particular issues that were at stake? What were the particular impulses that were at work? And what were the defining characteristics of that state as it emerges in the shadow of civil war in 1922 and 1923. That's an Ireland, of course, that James Joyce had long left. It had been 1912 since he had been in Ireland. That era, of course, is one in which it was quite clear that there were certain stirrings at work with regard to cultural nationalism, with regards to political nationalism, though in perhaps a quite understated way. What's fascinating about the 10 years after Joyce had left Ireland is the degree to which many of those tensions which had been bubbling beneath the surface come to the surface. And many of them become very difficult to manage, and the legacy and the fallout from those crucial years is one that arguably is still with us today. So I would be very conscious as we enter a period of commemorating 100 years of the events that ultimately led to the establishment of the Free State. I would be very conscious that we need to bring to bear some kind of historical context, some type of historical perspective, whilst keeping at the back of our minds, of course, this fundamental question of Joyce and where we situate him and how he might have viewed some of these particular events and some of these particular individuals. That period, 1922 to 1939, Anne has suggested, is one of those periods that is critical to an evaluation of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake in particular. It's very interesting that he begins that particular work at the same time as the beginnings of the Free State in 1922. It's also significant, I would think, that that book is published in 1939 at a very time when it becomes clear that this Free State is entering another phase, the beginning of the Second World War, the culmination of many of the Irish attempts in the 1920s and the 1930s to maximise sovereignty in order to be able to maintain its neutrality in the event of a global conflict. And that's precisely what happens, or certainly a version of it, in 1939. So in that sense, that time span of 1922 to 1939 is a crucial period for Joyce, obviously, post-Ulysses, post this huge challenge and gauntlet that has been laid down in terms of his future work, but also that crucial decade for the Free State, When we think of Joyce and his great work in progress, as it was labelled between 1922 and its publication in 1939, we can also think of the work in progress in terms of building the solid foundations of the Irish Free State, what ultimately became the Republic in the late 1940s. So you do have those parallel streams, if you like, which I think are particularly pertinent today. We also have a sense, and it's articulated very forcefully by Yeats in 1922, that this is indeed a new juncture and could possibly be a new juncture for James Joyce as well as this provisional new state. Time and time again, Yeats came back to the idea that this was a particularly important conjuncture, that a newly independent Ireland would be an Ireland that James Joyce could come back to, that James Joyce should come back to. The idea that Ireland in 1922, 1923, 1924 could now be proud and could express its pride in having an Irish novelist who had the stature of being now a great European novelist in the wake of the publication of Ulysses. And he did talk about Ireland now having a novelist who could stand alongside individuals such as Tolstoy and Balzac. And Yeats pressed this claim repeatedly during the 1920s in terms of inviting him back. The idea that this was a very significant opportunity for Joyce to come back to a very different Ireland. An Ireland that would appreciate him much more. An Ireland that, as Yeats put it at the time, was no longer afraid of genius and actually could admire that genius in the form of Joyce in the 1920s. He also suggested Dublin was an altogether more different city than the Dublin that James Joyce had left to seek exile. So Yeats was quite adamant about that in the 1920s. It's not an invitation, of course, that Joyce decided to take up. But 1922 was a year when Nora decided to come back. She was missing her family. And she did come to Ireland as the gathering clouds of the Civil War, the looming Civil War, were evident. And left the country in a hurry on that account and was quite frightened. James Joyce, of course, ever the egotist, was absolutely convinced that the shots that were being fired at the train that held Nora Joyce were in fact shots that were intended for him. The idea that he was still preoccupied with many of the animosities that had led him to abandon Ireland in the first place. And he did still conceive of the country, I suppose you could argue, in those terms. It's perhaps no surprise that he didn't return. I think he was quite pleased that Nora had to leave Ireland in such haste in the spring of 1922. But what exactly did that whole new phase of Irish history encapsulate? Yeats did insist that 1922 did mark the inauguration of a new phase. What were the characteristics of that new phase going to be? What were the influence and the legacy of the events of that new conjuncture, of that new phase of Irish history going to be? And how can we relate them back to what James Joyce had articulated so memorably in Portrait of the Artist? And these were particular passages that Gus Martin would have highlighted for me as an undergraduate student when I studied English and history when I came here in 1989. He talked in particular about those famous nets, and he also talked about the sense that Joyce had with regard to what he might or might not serve. And he quoted chapter 5, of course, of Portrait of the Artist. "I will not serve that which I no longer believe, whether it calls itself my home, my fatherland, or my church." And he suggested that he would use the only defence, the only arms that were available to himself to use: silence, exile, and cunning. And that is where Joyce is, it seems, at this time in 1922. He also, of course, talked about when the soul of a man is born in Ireland, what happens to it? The nets that were flung at it to hold it back from flight. And he wrote in Portrait of the Artist, "You talk to me of nationality, of language, of religion. I shall try to fly by those nets." So what did those nets mean in practice in the period 1922 to 1939? To what extent could they be escaped? To what extent had those nets become even wider and more dangerous? Not just in terms of freedom and liberty, not just in terms of expressions of cultural identity, but in terms of the legacy of the Civil War and the various different areas it pervaded and the various different influences that it had. That was a civil war that came about after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. This resulted in a political movement that had, at least on the surface, been united up to that point, becoming hopelessly divided, reflected in the reaction of Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin cabinet, the War of Independence Sinn Féin cabinet, splitting 4-3 in favour of this treaty. Many of the key individuals we associate with early 20th century Irish history were obviously central players in this regard. Arthur Griffith, for example, who had always espoused a more moderate nationalism, deciding that the treaty was a very honourable and a very workable solution to the Anglo-Irish dilemma. Very, in many respects, noble as far as he was concerned. You also had Michael Collins, who had signed the treaty in a much more reluctant fashion. And those, of course, who are now pitted against that treaty, including Eamon de Valera, one of the individuals who is going to go on to become one of the defining politicians of the 20th century. And here we had this split in cabinet which reflected so many of the tensions that arguably had been in evidence but perhaps papered over during earlier periods of the War of Independence. The key question, though, particularly as you move into 1922 and the conclusion of the very bitter and divisive treaty debates of early 1922, is the extent to which the people will be able to have a say on whether or not to endorse this particular compromise. When you think, for example, of the debates that went on in early 1922, of the attention that was being devoted to the idea of seeking a mandate, of the attention that was being devoted to the vote in favour of the treaty on the part of the Irish Parliament, the Irish Dáil, 64 votes in favour to 57 votes against. Very close, but not quite as close as that cabinet split. What was that going to mean in practice in terms of the Irish electorate delivering a verdict? There was a general election in June of 1922, which was regarded as an endorsement of the Anglo-Irish Treaty by the electorate. But it also became quite clear that many of those who were voting in 1922 were already tiring of what were regarded as abstract debates about oaths of allegiance, about constitutions, about constitutional forms of government. And that reminded me of a comment that was later to come from the wife of Sean O'Faolain, Eileen O'Faolain, who insisted that she was fed up with the amount of abstract Republicans in Ireland in the early 1920s. There were other debates about whether this was going to inaugurate a new phase of Irish democracy, or whether it represented the beginnings of Irish democracy itself. How was this new provisional Free State administration going to deal with the so-called diehards in the Republican movement who were going to not just refuse to endorse the treaty, but refuse to endorse or recognise the legitimacy or the validity of those who were seeking to implement it? The so-called diehard Republicans on the anti-treaty side in 1922 and 1923. They did decide to occupy a key building in Dublin city centre, the Four Courts building. And it was eventually the decision to move them out, to force them out, to bomb them out of the Four Courts in June of 1922 that led to the beginnings of the Irish Civil War that lasted until the spring of 1923. Not a particularly long civil war. Some would say not a particularly bloody civil war when you compare it to what happened in other countries, including Finland. But it was very short and very sharp and very divisive, but also decisive. When you consider what was at stake in 1922 and 1923, you can begin to appreciate why such a premium was being attached to the notion of proving, in the words of George Gavin Duffy, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs in early 1922, that the Irish were a nation and not a rabble. The idea that they needed to prove that they were capable of self-government. The idea that they needed to prove that they could manage their own affairs from here on. And that was something of an urgent message in 1922 and 1923. And the decisions that were made during the Irish Civil War, the state-backed executions of 77 anti-treaty Republicans, the widespread barbarity on both sides, the sense of a body politic that had been poisoned, the vengeance that is sought in 1922 and 1923. All of these left a very deep, a very lasting, and a very bitter legacy. And you've got to think of what that involved in terms of the character of the new state, and indeed the characteristics of those who were pressed with this great challenge of trying to build the foundations, the viable foundations of a new state. as well as the legitimacy of the Republican opposition. There has been a tendency in more recent times to be very simplistic about how you characterize both pro and anti-treaty Republicans. The idea of polar opposites, the idea of freedom versus tyranny, the idea of dictatorship versus democracy. No side had a monopoly on democracy during this period 1922 to 1923. Attitudes were hardened on both sides. Both sides engaged in all sorts of unsavoury and illegal acts. We do need to be careful not to characterise this period in black and white. And those who were living through it did not necessarily always see it in black and white, though there were, of course, those who did. And many of them were in very commanding positions. So you do have to be conscious of that particular legacy when you consider Ireland 1922 to 1939. It's not surprising that James Joyce began to see politics as a very destructive thing, particularly if he was looking at the Irish situation. But there were many at home for whom politics was their abiding preoccupation. It was of huge interest. The divisions of this era had the capacity, of course, to split individual families. There were many of those who survived who refused to speak about the Civil War, who refused to deal in an open and public way with its legacy. Those divisions remained very, very difficult and very raw. But the historian, of course, can look back now and see certain particular trends that were emerging which would have a relevance beyond the individual family unit. That sense of the characteristics of the state being defined by that Civil War legacy and by the events of 1922 to 1923. It was in many respects about the culmination of many of the issues that Stephen had addressed in Portrait of the Artist. The airbrushing, I suppose, of the legacy of the parliamentary tradition. What did the name Charles Stuart Parnell mean in Ireland in the 1920s? Very little, it seemed. What had the destruction of the constitutional nationalist project actually meant by the early 1920s? The rise of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and its influence as a secret revolutionary organisation in the late 19th and the early 20th century. The 1916 Rising. The great fad or the craze of Sinn Féin from 1917 onwards. The building of an extraordinary national movement. The emergence of a new generation of Republican activists. The engagement with the electoral process. The seeking of a mandate. The divisions over what constituted a mandate between 1918 and 1922. All of these issues were thrown into the mix. And you can see that many of the issues that Joyce was grappling with in the early 20th century did come to some kind of a boiling point at this period. It was a revolution in terms of the complete destruction of the Irish constitutional nationalist project. It was a revolution in terms of ensuring that there would be a native Irish government for the 26 counties of what became the Free State. There was a revolution in the sense of what had been achieved by taking on British imperialism at a much earlier stage than many other of those who had been colonised by the British Empire. It was a political revolution, but it wasn't a social revolution, which raises interesting questions about the issues that were at stake. When you consider the character of the state, the structures of the state, the extent to which they were going to rely on the structures that had already been in place, or else in seeking to build new structures, to rely very heavily on the British example. There was the expectation, and then there was the reality. And that perhaps is what you have to be most conscious of in the 1920s and the 1930s. What was the expectation of the Irish Revolution? And we can latch on to all sorts of rhetoric that we associate, the aspirational rhetoric towards greater equality, greater freedom, greater justice, the proclamation of 1916, the democratic programme of the first Dáil of 1919, the hoisting of this flag, the idea that in undoing British misrule in Ireland, there would be a very different Ireland. The expectation, the aspiration, the rhetoric, and then the reality. Whatever about the poetry of 1916 to 1919, there was then, of course, the governing in prose. And it was a governing through fairly austere prose in the 1920s and the 1930s. The events of the early 1920s, of course, affected the political culture. It also provided a lottery for the leadership of Irish politics into the 1920s and the 1930s. Quite simply, there were those that survived and those who didn't. There was also the question of centralisation. This was a state that became relentlessly centralised, partly as a result of the continuation of a British style of governance, partly as a result of the paranoia that developed in the early 1920s about consultation with the Irish people. A distrust of the notion of popular assemblies, of devolution, of allowing people to run their own affairs. The Irish, it was deemed imperative, have a strong, centralised system of administration and of government. Another one of the legacies of the Civil War era. There was a certain cultural insecurity there for other reasons. There were all sorts of power vacuums apparent in the early 1920s. There were various institutions and individuals who sought to fill them, including, of course, the Catholic Church, which had its own particular take on what the cultural priorities of this new state should be. The state itself, of course, sought to equate culture very much with the Irish language. Indeed, Irish language and the education system seemed to be virtually synonymous in the 1920s and the 1930s when it came to cultural priorities. And then there were the deep personal antagonisms and hatreds. De Valera, of course, for many, became the man that they could not forgive, precisely because of the position that he took in relation to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Precisely because of the language he was using in 1922 with regard to the possibility, or indeed the inevitability, of civil war. But as I mentioned earlier on, in many respects, what was being talked about in the 1920s in terms of the politics and the personalities of the period had merely been a delayed assessment or delayed judgment, public judgments. Many of these opinions had been expressed in private. That remark about that crooked Spanish bastard getting the better of that pasty-faced, blasphemous fucker from Cork. Reputedly the remarks of Ernest Blythe at the end of 1921. And note the timeline. These were divisions over strategy, over what constituted an Irish Republic, over what constituted a legitimate or indeed an admirable settlement that had been apparent throughout the War of Independence. And Ernest Blythe was merely giving voice to divisions that had been apparent as early as 1917. So don't assume that the divisions as they emerge are just a product of 1921 and 1922. What that Sinn Féin movement had represented in 1917 and 1918 was itself a compromise. When you consider within its ranks, you had those who were okay with monarchy. You had those who were devoted to the idea of a 32-county republic. You had those who were devoted to the idea of a less strident form of republicanism. It was a family. It was a coalition of diverse interests. And those divisions had been papered over in the interest of unity and electoral success in 1917 and 1918. But they were always there. And those remarks of Blythe do underline that sense in which the body politic was becoming poisoned. The extent to which those personality divisions will be very much played out in the 1920s and the 1930s. The extent to which it would be very difficult for many to forgive those they had deemed to have ultimately threatened not just the viability of the state, but to have fostered huge divisions within Irish life generally. And they were, of course, legacies that lasted for many decades. They did, of course, define not just the politics of the 20s and the 30s, but well beyond that. And there's also the question of whether what they were seeking in 1917 and 1918 was ever possible at all. And here I remember the words of Dennis McCullough, a veteran member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, as he reflected at a much later stage in his life. We lived in dreams always, he recalled. We never enjoyed them. I dreamt of an Ireland that did not exist and never could exist. And you can imagine the disappointments. You can imagine the grave sadness at what became of the Irish Revolution that prompted those kind of reflections at a much later stage. But even at that earlier stage, during the War of Independence, Michael Collins himself had admitted to an American journalist that none of us have ever really defined a republic. Now, he may have been talking about constitutions. He may have been talking about forms of government. But you could argue that that admission was just as applicable to the whole question of social change, of cultural diversity and cultural vibrancy. So you have to be conscious of all that. You have to be conscious of the extent to which it became a very patriarchal society, of the extent to which women, even though they had played such an important role in the struggle for independence, did find that this state as it emerged in the 1920s and the 1930s was quite a cold house. You've got to be conscious also of the degree to which the labour movement was in many respects marginalised as a result of the events of the War of Independence and Civil War period. The Labour Party performed very well in the 1922 election. Having stood aside in 1918 and again in 1921, it was determined that it would prioritise bread and butter issues. And there did seem to be a response. There did seem to be a sympathy. There did seem to be an idea of getting away from these debates about constitutional issues, which the Labour Party profited from in 1922. But in many respects, it was a false dawn. It was unable to sustain that particular momentum, partly as a result of the re-emergence of the anti-treatyites into constitutional politics towards the end of the 1920s. Labour must wait was one of the catch cries of the Irish Revolution, but it actually seemed even more pertinent and pronounced in the 1920s and the 1930s. And in the midst of all that, think of that Dublin that James Joyce had left behind as it was in 1922, in terms of the reality of everyday lives, in terms of the grinding poverty. 26,000 families in 1922 living in tenements in Dublin City. So whatever about these political divisions, there were also going to be these huge social and economic challenges in the 1920s and the 1930s. And presiding over all of this was the fundamental question of legitimacy. Could legitimacy, an attachment to the legitimacy of this state, be achieved? And what about the threats to it? At the end of the Civil War in 1923, there were 12,000 anti-treaty Republicans in prison in Ireland. So they are some of the issues that are of profound relevance to any framing of a discussion about the achievements or otherwise in the 1920s and the 1930s, the legacy of that Civil War. You also had, towards the end of 1922, a very firm pronouncement from the Catholic bishops that they would excommunicate active Republicans, that this was no longer a legitimate pursuit, that there was now in place an opportunity to build an allegiance to a state, an allegiance to various aspects of that state, but also, it seemed, an allegiance to the Catholic Church, which had, you could argue, been relatively mute during the War of Independence period, but by the end of 1922 is being very vocal in its assertions about a return to normality, about a return to peace. And it's fascinating to trace some, and many indeed, of the pronouncements of senior Catholic Church figures throughout the 1920s. This desperate desire for a return to peacetime. This idea that Ireland has experienced an extraordinary period of upheaval, of the abandonment of norms, of sometimes the abandonment of decency. And here now is a golden opportunity in the 1920s for a return to cherished Irish values. This, of course, was one of the great myths of Ireland during this period, and indeed prior to that. The idea that there were particularly Irish values, whether that was in relation to chastity, whether that was in relation to how people behaved, whether that was in relation to how people practiced their faith. There are an awful lot of myths entangled in these pronouncements of the 1920s, whether they are coming from church or state. Think of all of those denunciations that are a character of the 1920s. Sometimes I ask myself why so much had to be denounced if the Catholic Church was really as powerful in the 1920s as it has often been depicted. There's quite frequently an insecurity, a desperate insecurity running through many of the Catholic pronouncements from the 1920s. The denunciation not just of abuses, but the idea of an insecurity about whether the allegiance of the Irish is only skin deep. And again, that becomes, I would argue, a characteristic of Irish Catholicism throughout this period, the 1920s and the 1930s. There were within the Parliament the pro-treaty TDs in Dáil Éireann, who prior to this, of course, had been members of Sinn Féin, who fashioned themselves into a new political party, Cumann na nGaedheal. And that Cumann na nGaedheal party from the spring of 1923 is effectively a single-party government. Anti-treaty Sinn Féin are refusing to take their seats in the Dáil, and that remains the position until 1927. There were decisions that had to be made relatively quickly in the aftermath of the Civil War. Indeed, during the Civil War, decisions had to be made about the future leadership of the pro-treaty party. William Cosgrave emerges as a very interesting character. Not somebody who you would have assumed would have become a leader of the pro-treaty movement. Not somebody who had been regarded within Sinn Féin as a potential leader. But again, this goes back to the question of the Civil War proving to be something of a lottery when it came to political leadership. He was described at the time as having the manner of a relatively grey railway manager. The idea that he was not somebody considered to be particularly forceful or dynamic. And yet, in many respects, William Cosgrave was able to rise to the challenge that is there in 1923. Partly because of his ability to put key individuals into key ministries. Partly as a result of his determination that is forged by the Civil War. Dan Breen, for example, who was an anti-treaty Republican, recognised a steeliness in William Cosgrave, that he was prepared to execute 10,000 Republicans if he thought executing 10,000 Republicans would save the Free State. And as Dan Breen put it at the time, he means it. He was conscious of that steeliness, of that determination, of those who were also determined, of course, to carry on what they regarded as the unfinished work of Michael Collins, who had been struck down in his prime during the Civil War, the great lost leader of this period from the early 1920s. There's also a determination towards the end of 1922 to fashion a constitution for this new Free State, to give it a particular character, to give it particular priorities in terms of its form of government, in terms of its commitment to suffrage, in terms of its commitment to various different aspects of representative democracy. In other words, the foundations are being laid in place in all sorts of different ways. Cosgrave agreed to continue paying land annuities to the British government that were owed under land legislation of the late 19th and the early 20th century. And then you had his key ministers in various positions. Patrick Hogan, Minister for Agriculture, who was absolutely insistent that the economic future of Ireland was synonymous with its agricultural future, that you could not build a viable Irish economy at a time when 53% of the workforce were engaged in agriculture if you did not make that the number one economic priority. You had the Minister for Finance, Ernest Blythe, absolutely determined that this new state would balance its books. It's estimated that the Civil War cost in the region of £50 million, an extraordinary sum then. This was a very small and very poor state in that context. The huge damage that had been done to the infrastructure of that state. The need to pay compensation as a result of the Civil War period. All of these a huge drain, of course, on the limited resources of that particular government. And then the Minister for Justice, Kevin O'Higgins, who came to be regarded as the strong man of that government in the 1920s. And we are indebted to Kevin O'Higgins for many of the very vivid images which he articulated in terms of where they found themselves in 1922 and 1923. He referred to 8 young men in City Hall in Dublin, standing amidst the ruins of one administration with the foundations of another not yet built, and wild men screaming through the keyhole. And it's that stark, that austere image which we have of those young men. And don't underestimate their youth. This had been a revolution of the young, and this was going to be a very young government. He also talked about them being conservative revolutionaries in a debate on land seizures in the Dáil in the spring of 1923. Don't forget, we were the most conservative revolutionaries that ever put through a successful revolution. That wasn't defensive. That was, in many respects, a proud boast. We do have that sense from Kevin O'Higgins, even though he had his own private preoccupations, including an obsession with Lady Lavery, London society Lady Lavery, who had played an interesting role during the treaty negotiations in terms of being a conduit between the Irish representatives, Michael Collins in particular, and the British government. Many of them were carrying around their own particular private obsessions, their own particular private concerns. Many of them, their outlook had been darkened, had been blackened, had been darkened as a result of what they had experienced in the early 1920s. But they do have this devotion to the idea of austerity, of building a new state, of being firm in their convictions, of being decisive. And when I was thinking about Joyce recently in the context of his work in progress in the 1920s, what became Finnegans Wake, I was conscious of the degree that despite all of the upheavals, all the moves, all of the distractions, he always remained so wedded to the idea of finishing the damn book, of not being distracted from the words, from the task he had set himself. And again, to go back to this parallel idea that of the work in progress, the literary work in progress, and this state in progress. Again, you can see that same decisiveness, that determination not to be deflected from the main task at hand in the 1920s. And there were others who helped, and there were other initiatives that did suggest that this was indeed a very worthy work in progress. The creation of an Irish police force in August of 1923, the Garda Síochána, the Guardians of the Peace, an unarmed Irish police force at a time when society was particularly militarised. That was regarded quite rightly as a very significant achievement. You also had certain priorities beyond the Free State. Registering the treaty with the League of Nations, becoming fully fledged member of the League of Nations and involved at an international level with all sorts of dominion gatherings. The idea that this state would indeed have a foreign policy, that there would ultimately be an attempt to try and deliver on the promise of Michael Collins that the treaty would not be an end in itself, but an opportunity towards greater freedom, the so-called stepping stone interpretation of the Irish Treaty. There were pressing concerns at home with regard to defence and security. An army mutiny in 1924, which seemed to suggest that there was disgruntlement in the ranks of this Free State army. Those who had been loyal to Michael Collins, worried that those who had played no part or no significant part in the War of Independence were getting preferential treatment when it came to promotion. That there was a tendency to forget the legacy of Michael Collins. That this government was not intent or not serious on actually delivering on that legacy of Michael Collins. That army mutiny was quelled in 1924, regarded as another milestone in terms of securing the legitimacy of the state and indeed those who were charged with its defence. But it was not without casualties. Those who were still struggling with the notion of a separation of civilian power and military power were certainly experiencing in the middle of the 1920s various difficulties. There was also a famous cut in the old age pension. This was as a result of Ernest Blythe as Minister for Finance being adamant about the balancing of the books and about the extraordinary drain on the resources that the old age pension represented. An old age pension first introduced in Ireland by the British government in 1908. That was one of the headline events, it seems, for historians when it comes to trying to analyse and assess this government of the 1920s. And for obvious reasons. This was a government, a Commonwealth government in the 1920s that developed a reputation for being harsh, that developed a reputation for having very little of a social conscience, that developed a reputation for prioritising the balancing over the books, over delivering on any of the promises of the revolutionary period. There was also the grave disappointment with regard to the partition of Ireland that had been a reality since 1920. The border between North and South was confirmed in 1925. During the negotiations of the treaty, there had been this commitment on the part of the British government to the inclusion in the treaty of a promise of a boundary commission, which many of the Irish negotiators believed would ultimately result in a verdict that would render this small Northern Irish state simply unviable. But as it emerged in 1925, the report of this boundary commission made it absolutely clear that there was going to be no significant gains for the Free State. And that report of the Boundary Commission was effectively buried in 1925. And between that, arguably, between 1925 and 1969, you did not have any serious engagement by successive Irish governments with this question of partition and what was over the border. So that in itself was a decisive moment in 1925. The idea of the abandonment of any aspiration, it seemed, towards a united Ireland, or any aspiration that they could give any kind of meaning to. You've also got to be conscious of what's going on within the anti-treaty Republican side. De Valera's solitary confinement, particularly in the year after the Civil War, is of profound importance, I would argue, in terms of getting him to think about how he might get out of the Republican straitjacket he has found himself in. De Valera wrote some extraordinarily revealing letters during the Civil War that suggested he was not in the die-hard camp. He wrote to Mary McSweeney, for example, a Republican colleague of his, sister of Terence McSweeney, who had died during the War of Independence as Lord Mayor of Cork. Nature never fashioned me to be a partisan leader. Every instinct I have would indicate that I was meant to be a dyed-in-the-wool Tory or even a bishop rather than the leader of a revolution. What De Valera had surmised by that point was that he could no longer share the same ideology as many of those in the Republican movement during the Civil War, particularly those who had occupied the forecourts. De Valera did not see any future in terms of practical politics by staying with Sinn Féin. And the abandonment of Sinn Féin, the emergence of Fianna Fáil in May of 1926, is something of a milestone in the evolution of Free State politics. De Valera deciding to fashion a new political movement. De Valera had decided, I think, in solitary confinement, to look for a way out, to look for a way of building a Republican alliance, of going back to the original Sinn Féin network in order to try and create a political platform from which he could ultimately rip up the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. And that's what that initiative was about in the spring of 1926. What helped De Valera in many respects was the murder of Kevin O'Higgins by the IRA in July of 1927. The murder of the strongman, the Minister for Justice, on his way to Mass in Booterstown in 1927. The Public Safety Act as a response to that. Special courts with military members. And then a legislative initiative later in that year, the Electoral Amendment Act of 1927. Electoral candidates in the Free State, according to this particular stipulation, will be required to declare their intention to take their seats if elected. So this policy of abstentionism on the part of Sinn Féin, on the part of this new Fianna Fáil, is one that is no longer going to be viable. That allowed De Valera to cross the Rubicon. That allowed De Valera to begin the process of refashioning this Republican movement in the direction of constitutional politics. And of course the question that many asked was whether this issue had ever been worth a civil war. The Oath of Allegiance, the detested Oath of Allegiance that was a part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, had been the most divisive and most emotive aspect of that treaty. Was it worth a civil war, of course, was the question that was being asked in 1927 when De Valera decided to take his particular position, decided to take his seat in the Dáil along with his Fianna Fáil candidates. They were taking the Oath of Allegiance. They may have been taking it with their fingers crossed behind the back, but they were taking it nonetheless. And you can see how that issue of the man they could not forgive was brought into even more sharp focus as a result. But it was that great out, I think, for De Valera. Now you can appreciate the challenges that were there in the 1920s. Not just as a result of the violence, not just as a result of the penury, not just as a result of all of those different pressures. There were certain ambitious, adventurous steps taken in terms of trying to get the state to more actively intervene, despite the free trade sympathies of many of those who were fashioning economic policy. There was the great hydroelectric Shannon scheme, for example, which was finally opened at the end of 1929. An extraordinarily adventurous engineering project in international terms in order to try and harness water to create electricity. There was also the creation of a number of different state boards and state bodies. The Agricultural Credit Corporation, the Electricity Supply Board. Again, putting that infrastructure in place in order to try and build a wider sense of a state that was at work and a state that was going to cater for the future in terms of its economic and its social needs. Certain of those initiatives, you could argue, came too late in the day. Internationally, the Statute of Westminster in December of 1931 did release the dominions from the legislative supremacy of the Imperial Parliament. Again, this did pave the way for a lot of the initiatives that were to come in the 1930s. You did have very active individual ministers like Desmond Fitzgerald, Minister for External Affairs, who were very preoccupied with that sense of the Free State having an international role. And they were working through various of those Dominion assemblies and Dominion gatherings that I mentioned earlier on. You had something of a cultural vacuum, there's no doubt about that. And yet at the same time there was that firm state commitment to providing a subsidy for the Abbey Theatre. The only country in the world that was willing to provide a state-subsidised theatre at that time. Whether or not that Abbey was confronting reality, indeed at a later stage whether the Gate Theatre was confronting reality, was another question. There was a huge sensitivity around how you could dramatically depict contemporary Ireland or events of the previous couple of years. Sean O'Casey, of course, was to find that when he staged The Plough and the Stars in 1926. Provoking a ferocious reaction. What Sean O'Casey seemed to be doing in 1926 was acting as historian, 50 years before the historians actually managed it, in terms of challenging some of the foundation myths of the state. That was an Ireland at that time in which the census of 1926 had revealed there were 800,000 people living in overcrowded conditions. There were 4,500 people dying every year from tuberculosis, the great killer, TB. Sean O'Casey was writing, of course, about those inner city communities that he was familiar with. What did the revolution mean for them? What did the Free State mean to them in the 1920s? And where were the promises of that revolutionary era? These are questions that are being asked by Sean O'Casey and others. It's difficult for them often to get a sympathetic hearing. It's difficult for them to find space. It's difficult for many who want to write in a realistic way about Ireland at that time. It's not helped, of course, by the operation of censorship as it emerges in the 1920s and into the 1930s. The first censorship board for publications was constituted in February of 1930. There's a great focus throughout this period on vigilance, whether that's in relation to books, whether that's in relation to what's constituted as indecent or obscene, whether that's in relation to dance, whether that's in relation to drink. And again, going back to this idea of the denunciations that exist about excesses in all of these different areas. There were attempts to tackle the loaded question of licensing legislation, whether or not this was a free state that was far too dependent on its licensed premises. Whether or not this was a city, Dublin, that was an embarrassment because of its thriving red light district, which was, of course, clamped down on by the middle of the 1920s by groups such as the Legion of Mary, in conjunction with other authorities. Again, the idea of there being a premium attached to that notion of eternal vigilance. The evil ones are ever setting their snares for unwary feet, as was put in one of the pastorals of the Catholic hierarchy in the middle of the 1920s. And that is reflected, of course, in the emergence of censorship legislation. Irish writers were not necessarily against censorship. Many of them were against the way in which it was implemented and the way in which it operated. Yeats and others did respond. The Irish Academy of Letters being one example of that, in order to try and build an alternative alliance, in order to try and challenge these particular cultural priorities. They were swimming against the tide in many respects. That was another opportunity for Yeats to offer an opportunity for Joyce to join them, to return, to make his views known in that regard. Again, something he was not going to respond to in any way. And this was not by any means just an Irish phenomenon. Joyce, as you'll be well aware, had his own problems at an earlier stage with the New York Society for the Prevention of Vice. So these are the Irish manifestations of debates and of practices that are relevant in other parts of the country. The challenge for Fianna Fáil as it emerges in the late 1920s is not necessarily to begin to revise those cultural priorities. It really is about promoting another issue altogether, and that issue is one of maximising political sovereignty. The triumph in the 1932 general election, the changing of the Guard, the peaceful changing of the Guard, another snap election in 1933 in which De Valera manages an overall majority. Fianna Fáil stay there until 1948. This is an extraordinary comeback by anyone's standards for Eamon de Valera. But what's it actually going to mean in practice, in terms of the actual priorities of the Free State as it is at that time? The Eucharistic Congress that was held in Dublin in 1932 was a perfect opportunity for de Valera and others to emphasise their impeccable Catholic credentials. When you consider the difficulties, the excommunications of the Civil War era, here was a period of transition. Here was a period to emphasise that this Fianna Fáil movement would not be threatening when it came to the status of religion in Irish society. There may have been tensions behind the scene that lingered, but here was a very public way to express and to be very demonstrative about what they meant in terms of their Catholic identity. And the great mobilisation that is on display in Ireland in 1932, in stark contrast, of course, to the current Eucharistic Congress, a very different Ireland, one in which you have this fashioning of a notion that this is indeed a Catholic state for a Catholic people. So those cultural priorities, those religious priorities, in many respects stay the same. It's those political priorities that change. And it's also economic priorities that change in terms of the fashioning of an agenda of self-sufficiency. And international events facilitated that in many respects. The great Wall Street crash of 1929 made the notion of self-sufficiency much more palatable and acceptable. The building up of tariff barriers, the idea of returning to a reliance on tillage, of building up a protected industrial sector. The idea that Fianna Fáil was very much going to represent the men of no property. And they were borrowing these phrases from Irish history in order to fashion themselves as the party of the less well-off. And they were responded to. Fine Gael had, as I mentioned, prioritised the notion of free trade, the reliance on exports, the reliance on agricultural exports. Many of the substantial, prosperous farmers doing very well out of Commonwealth government. Here we have a different focus, it seems. The emphasis on the agricultural labourers, those who were farming very small farms. The idea that this was a Fianna Fáil party that would conceive of an Ireland that was going to deliver ultimately on some of the promises of 1916 and 1919. Now that did involve an economic war with Britain in the early 1930s that lasted ultimately until 1938. The idea that de Valera was no longer going to authorise the payment of the land annuities that William Cosgrave had agreed to continue paying in the early 1920s. The reaction of Britain to that in terms of penalising Irish products that were coming into Britain. And the counter-reaction by the Irish government. This was, to all intents and purposes, a political war under the guise of an economic war. But it did do damage to an awful lot of Commonwealth supporters. It was popular in many respects with those who felt they had little to lose and much to gain from de Valera's emphasis on binding economic and political sovereignty. There were, once again, the emergence of key ministers, of very able individuals like Sean McEntee, like Sean Lamass, like James Ryan, people with very strong views, held together by this very authoritative figure, Eamon de Valera. Somebody who was, in many respects, a chief rather than a chairman, as William Cosgrave had often been depicted. There were certainly challenges there in terms of the environment that existed. Huge concerns about the protection of free speech. Huge concerns about what de Valera might actually do with power once he had it. The emergence of the Blue Shirt movement, Ireland's fascist movement, Ireland's version of the international fascist movement. A movement that was resisted. A movement of extremists that was resisted. Don't underestimate the fears that existed about freedom of expression, about the protection of fundamental rights. They were very evident in the middle of the 1930s. And you had the fashioning of legislation which was designed to bolster the notion, once again, of a cultural self-sufficiency. A tax on the importation of foreign newspapers. In 1935, a Criminal Law Amendment Act, which ensured that contraception and the importation of contraception would be made a criminal offence. And yet de Valera had to be pragmatic about his political priorities. Despite making common cause with his former comrades, with those who had opposed the treaty, with those who were still in the IRA, by 1936 the IRA has been declared an illegal organisation. De Valera in some respects has become, once again, the gamekeeper. This idea that de Valera had to be once again wedded to the notion of the legitimacy of the state and any threat to the legitimacy of that state, whether or not it came from his former colleagues or elsewhere. So there are those priorities there in political terms. And then there are the social priorities. The building of 82,000 houses between 1932 and 1942, an area that Cumann Gael had neglected. And you can see how Fianna Fáil is building its support base in both rural areas and urban areas, particularly working class areas. One of the extraordinary successes of Fianna Fáil over the course of its long life up to 2011 was in building these alliances across class boundaries. And you can see the beginnings of it here in the 1930s. Not just through the building of houses, but also the introduction of widows' pensions, of orphans' pensions in the middle of the 1930s. The idea, as was articulated on many occasions by Sean Lamass, that there was no need for a Labour Party in Ireland because Fianna Fáil was the Irish Labour Party. And that was a taunt at the Labour Party that bedevilled them for decades to come. In many respects, Fianna Fáil had stolen the political clothes of the Labour Party in the 1930s and reaped the electoral benefits from that. Now, arguably, that was not the case the longer Fianna Fáil was in power as we moved towards the end of the 1940s, but it's certainly something that was being realised by contemporaries in the middle of the 1930s. And again, there is De Valera's fashioning of a new constitution, the 1937 constitution, the expectations that existed and the reality, a certain risk that De Valera was taking. This was a constitution that was put to the Irish people. And the vote on that constitution, the referendum on that constitution, proved to be a very close-run thing. A very narrow majority in favour of it. Fears being expressed about different articles in the constitution. When you consider what was involved in specific articles, specific provisions, the creation of an office of president. Was this an example of De Valera seeking to create an office that he could abuse? Many of his opponents in politics thought it was. What about the articles relating to the status of women? This articulation of a notion that the woman's place was in the home. This was now to be enshrined. This was now, it seemed, the official ideology of the state. It caused concern to a minority of politicised women, many of those who had been involved in the War of Independence period. And again, if you're to draw some kind of a parallel with James Joyce and Eamon de Valera, if that's possible, you can think about what James Joyce was doing with regard to the women who had helped him in the 1920s. How was he treating them by the 1930s? Think of those who had financed him. Think of Weaver. Think of Beach. Think of those who had made it possible for James Joyce to continue working on his literature. And how he is treating them by the 1930s. There were Irish Republican women who articulated a similar feeling about Eamon de Valera by the end of the 1930s, that he who had relied so heavily upon them was now instrumental in fashioning articles and his ministers fashioning legislation that was actively discriminating against them. The development of that notion of the Free State as being a very patriarchal state. And yet there was within that constitution an indication that De Valera and his colleagues were wedded to the notion of fundamental human rights. They may not always have been spelt out. They ultimately were by the Irish courts over the course of subsequent decades. There was a guaranteed protection for Jews, for example, in the 1937 Constitution, which, given the international climate at that time, was a significant step. There was a healthy preoccupation with the notion of the separation of the powers of the state and the powers of the judiciary. It's a constitution we still have. It's a constitution that many believe needs to be replaced. Perhaps those calls are wide of the mark. But nonetheless, for the 1930s, you could argue very trenchantly that the 1937 Constitution was a significant human rights document. De Valera was also preoccupied ultimately with Anglo-Irish relations. And again, this is where we see the reason why he wanted to retain the Foreign Affairs brief for himself as well as being Prime Minister. De Valera's foreign policy in the 1930s was always heading towards one particular direction. As far as he was concerned, if you could not implement an independent foreign policy, you could not claim to be an independent state. And many of the Anglo-Irish initiatives of the 1930s are built around a notion that was articulated by the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs, Joseph Walsh. Our international position will let the world and the people at home know that we are independent. Simple words, but how would you actually bring that about? And what De Valera did in that regard was to negotiate very successfully with the British government. He did all sorts of other things in terms of the abolition of the oath of allegiance, in terms of getting rid of the Governor-General, the King's representative in Ireland under the terms of the treaty. He effectively ripped up the pages of the treaty in fashioning a new constitution. But it was ultimately the agreement of 1938 that ended the economic war and that got Ireland the treaty ports back, which could ultimately deliver on what he wanted. The ports that had been controlled by Britain under the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty for military, defensive purposes, for naval purposes, had been clawed back by De Valera by 1938. And that was the last piece of the jigsaw that became the Declaration of Neutrality in 1939. So De Valera's priorities in many respects had been clear throughout the 1930s in the realm of Anglo-Irish negotiations. He often achieved what he did precisely because he wasn't a diehard. Sometimes the British, who were still relying on out-of-date files on De Valera, the wild man, were surprised at the extent to which he was willing to compromise, and as a result sometimes gave him more than even he thought he would get at the outset. So what you have by the end of the 1930s are all sorts of firm foundations in place. De Valera's Constitution of 1937 in many respects represented the values that had been built up over 15 years of the Free State, not just the 5 years since Fianna Fáil had been in power. And in that sense you can see the various foundations that had been laid since the early 1920s. In that sense you can see the degree to which there was success in terms of state building. Whatever about the cultural deficiencies, the social deficiencies, the economic difficulties, the extent to which emigration was going to remain an essential part of the Irish experience, there was at least a certain pride in this notion of the development of autonomy, of the maximising of sovereignty. And again, it's interesting in the modern era that De Valera's name is often being invoked in the context of our current crisis. Or indeed, that generation as a whole, that revolutionary generation as a whole, that its spirits and ghosts are being invoked in the context of our contemporary crisis. Whatever about their mistakes seems to be the argument, we need to return to the ideals and the ambitions of the founders of the state in order to begin to think about how we might recover. Now that's very convenient. It glosses over an awful lot of the awkward bits of Irish history in the 1920s and the 1930s. It simplifies what was a complex task. It does tend to assume that the ideals and the ambitions that they had in the 1920s and the 1930s were very clear-cut and were very noble. They weren't always. And yet there is that devotion to the notion of sovereignty. There is that devotion to the notion of sovereignty, of austerity in its positive sense. And there is also that devotion to the idea of state building, what can be achieved, to recover from the divisions of the early 1920s. Now, it's apparent by the end of the 1930s that the declaration of the emergency in Ireland, which is the phrase we use to describe, or was used to describe, the period of the Second World War, that in itself is not going to be clear-cut. There was a contribution made by James Dillon, for example, in opposition to the policy of neutrality. He was an opposition deputy. That this declaration of neutrality was about calling the world to witness that this war is no affair of ours. Of course, in a strictly combatant sense, it was not going to be a preoccupation of this free state. But it was ultimately going to be about the maximising of sovereignty. And that was deemed to be the political priority by the end of the 1930s. And whatever compromises and whatever distortions were necessary over the course of 1939 to 1945, that was going to remain, at least in public, the line. That this represented the culmination, the successful culmination of the implementation of an independent foreign policy, and indeed the successful culmination of a crucial, vital period of state building. James Joyce, of course, was there at the very end of that period in terms of 1939 into 1940. Joyce, of course, was baffled at the response to Finnegans Wake. But there didn't seem to be an understanding of the book's complexity. What De Valera, at least, could say by 1940 was that people understood his position. Thank you for your patience.
Sorry, Anne.